There are a whole host of reasons why I think it's exciting that immigration detention is included in these discussions on comprehensive immigration reform, precisely because one thing that I felt very strongly about based on my experiences is the need to enhance due process protections for people that are in immigrant detention, as well as to enhance accountability on behalf of DHS, or Department of Homeland Security, ICE, in terms of how they engage in immigration enforcement, as well as their practices regarding the detention of immigrants. There are a lot of reasons that I can elaborate on why that is. So for example, one of the major issues that the ACLU is concerned about is what we're calling indefinite detention, sort of individuals who already have an order of deportation and yet still remain for many months within the custody of ICE in these detention centers. For example, one case that we dealt with recently, a man was actually held at the Stewart Detention Center 14 months after. He didn't spend all the time at Stewart, but he had an order of deportation and he remained in custody for 14 months after that order. The reason this is significant is because there's actually a constitutional standard that was established in the Zagvitas decision, which is a fairly recent decision that says that ICE cannot take an indefinite amount of time to effect the deportation of someone. The reasonable standard, or the standard where deportation, the period is no longer deemed reasonable, is 6 months. So this individual clearly fell outside of that standard, and the only reason he was held there was because he was effectively stateless. He was born in the Bahamas. His parents then took him to Haiti. His parents are from Haiti. He was born in the Bahamas, and he was born there after his parents fled from Haiti. They then subsequently went to the United States, where they all became legal permanent residents. However, even long-time legal permanent residents, because they're not citizens, are still subject to immigration law. So in this particular individual's case, he had become a U.S. legal permanent resident, but didn't have any other state within which he would have been eligible for citizenship. He committed a minor crime. He actually sold, a very small amount of crack to an undercover officer. For that, he committed a crime that was considered one that would render him deportable. So he ended up being placed in immigrant detention. However, because he was stateless and there was no other place for him to declare citizenship, he was indefinitely bounced from facility to facility. No one was willing to review his case. DHS officers just kept passing his file, from facility to facility. And he was facing indefinite detention precisely because no one facility wanted to take his case. No facility reviewed him for supervised release, which he should have been eligible for at the 6-month period. And so, without intervention, it's unclear if he would have actually ever been released from custody. He was subsequently released from custody. But this is one of the different types of cases that we have seen a lot of, where individuals remain in detention far past the 6-month standard. And it's unclear that without any intervention if they would actually be eligible or would be able to lobby and secure their release. I think that the ACLU definitely, it has endorsed some recent bills, as I had mentioned. One is the Standards Act, and this actually they just endorsed this within the past week. And I have this here because the word standards is actually an acronym for Safe Treatment, Avoiding Needless Deaths, and Abuse Reduction in the Detention System. It seems like a mouthful, but the reason why this bill is so important is because the current standards that govern detention facilities don't have the force of law. They're considered contractual obligations between ICE and a particular detention facility, and they govern, they cover everything from work opportunities that are within the detention facilities to phone access, how you can use the phones and who you can call, visitation hours and access in facilities. All of these things that govern every aspect of an immigrant detainee's existence don't have the force of law. So if they're violated, there's no real recourse for the immigrant detainee in detention. So part of what the Standards Act does, it doesn't codify these into regulations. There was a recent conflict over this where many groups have been trying very hard to get the Obama administration and the previous administration to actually codify these regulations, and that recently failed in the courts. But this particular act would do things like ensure that there is telephone access for people that are in immigrant detention. This is a big deal, because I know, for example, from personal experience, no one knows how the phones work, or none of the immigrant detainees that I've been able to interview actually really understand how the phones work in Atlanta, the Atlanta City Detention Center, for example. They know they can make collect calls, they know that there's a $30 international phone card that they could use, but in terms of making domestic calls, they can't, navigate those phone systems very well, and it directly impedes their ability to secure counsel, to talk to their family members, among other things. And so part of the thing that the Standards Act would do is to require DHS to provide adequate medical care, to ensure that there's access to phones for immigrant detainees in these detention centers, as well as to establish an alternative to immigrant detention program, which is a very major improvement, because what it would do is ensure that more people who should not be detained, for various reasons, either they're facing indefinite detention because they're stateless, for example, and they can't secure travel documents. They may be asylum seekers, because right now many different jurisdictions have a lot of discretion in terms of whether or not to release asylum seekers on parole and release them from detention centers. And so the Standards Act would ensure that those types of vulnerable populations, or individuals who have faced trauma, would actually be subject to release, or be more likely to secure release from detention and placed on supervised release or other types of alternatives. This is a big deal too for another reason. I mean, it's expensive to detain people. I mean, we're talking, there was a study done that determined how much it would cost to detain someone on average versus placing them on a supervised release program. And the difference is between $95 a day and $12 a day, all at the taxpayer expense. So, if you think about, what taxpayers are paying for in terms of, their immigrant detention system, it's a very costly system, and to detain people unnecessarily, especially if there are many alternatives that may be available to them. For example, one of the models for alternatives to detention for asylum seekers is in this state. Actually, it's Freedom House, which is right outside Detroit. There should be more alternatives like that are promoted in other states as well, as alternatives to detention. Due process is a constitutional right in our, under the Fifth Amendment of our Constitution, that no one should be deprived of life or liberty without due process, or property without due process of law. Many people's lives are being, interrupted and destroyed by detention, especially if it's unnecessary immigration detention. And I think that family lives are being disrupted by this. One of the stories that really got to me was one individual who was in California, who is undocumented, but had learned that his brother, who was living in Georgia, was injured on the job. He could not work anymore, he couldn't drive because he had a major arm injury. So he decided to leave his family to help his brother out in Georgia. Because Georgia has a whole host of what are called 287G agreements with local law enforcement, where local law enforcement officers are deputized to perform immigration functions. He was stopped by one of the police officers in one of these counties, and the next thing he knew, he showed them a Mexican driver's license, because he did have ID, but it was a Mexican driver's license, and he was taken into immigrant detention. And when we met with him, he just said, I don't understand. I was just trying to help my brother out. I don't understand, why I didn't commit any crimes. I've lived a pretty, productive life in the United States. I don't understand why I'm being deported. And I think so when I think about stories like that, and I think about how this interfaces with the law, I think just fundamental protections against deprivations of liberty, right, that just seems so out of sync with, the lived realities of immigrants in the United States. Making sure that we have standards that govern our immigration detention facilities that ensure that people can visit their loved ones or have reasonable visitation with loved ones, that they have access to phones, that they're not treated like criminals when they're in immigrant detention, because immigration detention is not a form of criminal detention, it's a civil form of detention, and so they should not even be they shouldn't even be comparable or analogous in any way. And yeah, I think those are the main reasons it's critical, because I think it's important to support those basic constitutional protections for everyone.